Welcome to Otto Antoine, 1865 to 1951, the painter of Berlin between compliance and defiance, in our series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression. I'm Rachel Stern, Executive Director of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. Today, I introduce two esteemed speakers. Kathleen Langone is a researcher and freelance writer. Prior to 2000, she worked part-time as a researcher for state government agencies, providing records on natural history. Recently, she has produced a podcast series, People Hidden in History, with 22 episodes covering profiles for lesser known but fascinating persons in America from the 1600s through to the early 1960s. One of most popular episodes chronicles the life and times of William Scherer in 1930s Berlin and his first-hand account of the rise of Nazism. She has had an active speaking career, being well received at museums, historical societies, and has been interviewed on TV and radio. Most recently, she did extensive research on two artists who were also relatives of hers, Otto Antoine and Amalia Küssner. Her biography on Küssner, a Gilded Age artist, will be published in spring of 2025. Dr. Jacqueline Delin MacDonald joins us for the conversation following Kathleen's presentation. She's an art historian whose research focuses on art and its historicity from German-speaking countries, sculptural types, American art, and women artists during the long 19th and 20th centuries. Her current book project involves the study of German-American sculptor Elizabeth Ney. She has published on Ney as well as the sculptor's phenomenon of the late 19th century. She's currently a lecturer at the University of Texas at Dallas and an adjunct professor for the University of North Texas, where she designed and taught a course on Nazi looting, provenance, and restitution. She has held fellowships with the US Capitol as well as the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History. After the presentations, there will be time for Q&A, so please post your questions. Welcome now, Kathleen and Jacqueline, and give the floor to Kathleen. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rachel, for that introduction. And I'm delighted and honored to be part of this series. So why don't we jump right in? As Rachel had mentioned, Otto Antoine is a very distant relative of mine, and I grew up around some of his paintings. And later in life, I decided to research him, partly for the podcast series that I have, and this is the result of that research. So Otto Antoine was born in Koblenz. Koblenz is a beautiful, beautiful city in Germany, and it is centered, they call it the confluence of the Moselle River and the Rhine River. Of course, this is key, what I call white wine country. Just a beautiful area. In fact, I traveled there a number of years ago, just lovely, low-lying river plain area for him to have grown up in. His father was a watchmaker. His mother, Anna Maria Roskin, now she was a sister to my great-great-grandfather, so that's how we are connected. And Antoine did show an early ability to painting and sketching, and he did enroll as a master painter or in a master painter apprenticeship, but due to economic restrictions, he had to leave that. He briefly volunteered in the military for about a year and a half, and his earliest works were in watercolor. So as you can see on this slide, there is a self-portrait sketch of Antoine. I would put that at probably around 1900. And on the right-hand side is a map of Koblenz around also 1900. Here are some of Antoine's works. The woman on the left, I think, might be his mother, Maria. I'm having trouble reading that, but that very well could have been his mother. By the way, these images you're looking at right now are from the Todd Barrowcliff collection. Todd has right now the largest collection of Otto Antoine paintings. We'll talk more about him in the collection a little bit. So again, we have this watercolor on the left. on the upper right-hand side, sort of a nice little village scene. And notice the door, the bright green. A lot of his paintings would have this pop of bright color, which I found interesting. In the lower right-hand corner, I am guessing those might have been castles along the Rhine River. There are many, older sort of crumbling castles that are still beautiful on the Rhine River. All right, the photo on the left is my great-great-grandfather, John Philip Roskin. He would have been an uncle to Otto Antoine. And he and Antoine's mother grew up, I think, in a well-to-do family because their father was a lawyer in Koblenz. You could see Roskin here has a stethoscope around his neck. He actually got a medical degree at the University of Heidelberg, and then shortly after went to America, where my family settled. The lovely watercolor on the right-hand side was his daughter, Otto Antoine's daughter, Antoinette Antoine, done in the late 1890s. And I love this painting. She's either crying or yawning, I don't know which, but he really captured this baby's expression. Antoinette Antoine would later move to the United States in the 1920s. She married and settled there, and we'll reference her in a little bit. And this painting on the right is from the Todd Barrowcliff collection. So let's talk a little bit about his training. As we did mention, he did try to go into an apprenticeship when he was in his early 20s, but again, due to economics, had to switch out of that. But he was fortunate to connect with Germany's postal service and served in the postal service, probably about 40 years. And as part of that job, he moved to Berlin in 1891. He did marry, by the way, in 1894 in Berlin. But in 1891, because of his artistic ability, the Postal Service allowed him to take art training while still being employed in the Postal Service. He studied at the Prussian Academy of Art for at least a couple of years. And it's interesting to note that he studied with Franz Skarbina. Franz Skarbina himself was a painter, and he was very much into the Impressionistic movement in France. And he had at least a couple of trips to France, very much part of the height of Impressionism in France. And while he was a professor at the Prussian Art Academy, he rebelled a little bit. So a few years after 1891, he actually left his role as professor at the Prussian Academy. And this is because he and some other artists wanted to start to display Impressionistic art, or art that was almost seen as being too radical at the time. And also even Kaiser Wilhelm II stepped in and said he did not approve of this art. And Franz Skarbina became part of a group of 11. And again, these artists wanted to display their art at the major art exhibits in Berlin. And they established a group that was called the Berlin Secession Movement in 1898. So there were really, I think, two influences that Skarbina had on Otto Antoine, both the Impressionistic art style, but maybe a little bit of rebelliousness too. With the influence of Skarbina, Antoine's work switched from watercolor to oils. Now, the painting you see on the right is actually one of the works of Skarbina, and this is At the Cilician Gate, is the name, done in 1894. It has a very impressionistic style to it, but it's also a bit of a cityscape, which was another famous style of Otto Antoine. Otto Antoine, again, was very involved in his job with the German Postal Service. And one of the things that the Postal Service wanted to advertise, if you will, is that their services were really international. So just about everywhere you lived in the world, you could receive and send mail to Germany. And as part of that, they actually sent Otto Antoine to these far-flung places to do paintings and show, this country we have German Postal Service to. The painting you see right here is actually the island of Tenerife, part of the Canary Islands. This painting was done in 1905. Now, this is a smaller study piece. It's actually not that large of a painting. So Antoine would do these studies and then take them back with him to Berlin and then do larger paintings. I also know that they sent him to Africa, South Africa, a few other countries, and he painted Mount Kilimanjaro. But look too at the colors here. There's some really brilliant colors, and there's a beautiful peacock blue, if you will, in the water here. I love this combination of paintings. It's very interesting what's going on here. The top painting was painted by Hans Hartig, that was a classmate of Otto Antoine's in the 1890s, obviously a painting in his own right. And Hans Hartig came from this area. This is a beautiful lagoon that is between the border of Germany and Poland. It's where Hartig grew up. And he and Antoine would go there during their summers to do painting. So Hartig painted Otto Antoine painting the sail patcher right there. So the gentleman you see in the blue with the little cap, he is patching a sail. But again, this is a representative of Otto Antoine and the easel. What you're going to see in the lower right-hand corner is Otto Antoine's picture of the sail patcher. And, I compared these two paintings, and at first I thought that Antoine had copied the sail patcher and everything around him. But if you look closely, it's not identical. The color of the sail patcher's outfit and the cap are very similar, but what he's sitting on and some of the details around it are different. So it could have been that what you see Antoine painting here is actually in this lower right-hand corner. So I just love this combination. And this lagoon was called the Secessin Lagoon. So here again, we have a painting done by Otto Antoine. This was in 1917. And the writing on this painting, I'll read at the bottom. Antoine, 1917, lower right. So his signature was in the lower right. And there was an old label on the back of this painting that had the location name of the town Nieuworp, which I guess was one of the towns on this lagoon. And so I just think it's interesting. And if you look at this painting in the lower right-hand corner, that might be the same dock he was on before. It's hard to say, but it's very similar to that dock. Antoine was not only adept at painting, he also was very, very fine with doing engraving, beautiful penmanship, etc. So what you see here, and this is also from the Todd Barrowcliff collection, it's a pen and ink, and it was basically a Happy New Year card, if you will, from the German Postal Service, and it translates to Happy New Year from the Reich Postmaster Berlin in 1900. And I think too there was maybe some watercolor highlights, because you see around 1900 it's yellowish, but I love the detail on this. Here's another piece of work, an engraving by Otto Antoine. This was done for a Protestant pastor in Germany whose name was Oskar Goling. And the inscription at the top, Ora et labora, is working and praying, which is so appropriate for a Protestant pastor. And I believe the engraving appears to be maybe the outline of a church. And then you see ex libris, which means, of course, out of the library of Oskar Goling. We have a picture of Oskar. He looks very serious. Now, Otto Antoine also had a connection with Kaiser Wilhelm II. I would say he was what I would term a secondary court painter of Kaiser Wilhelm. And there are two known paintings that are associated with the Kaiser. The one you see on this slide was done in 1912 by Otto Antoine. It is a birthday parade for Kaiser Wilhelm II in Berlin. This may have been directly commissioned by the Kaiser. There's a second painting that's in a private collection of my family called The Kaiser's Hunting Lodge. And that, I think, was probably a direct commission to Otto Antoine, because he had to be on the property of the Kaiser's Hunting Lodge, and we'll see that. You see a black and white photo of the hunting lodge, very elaborate. And this building was actually designed by a Norwegian architect. And if you look especially on the far right-hand side, the turret, this sort of elaborate woodwork that you would see on Norwegian buildings. So again, there's a lot of Norwegian influence here. This was in a part of Germany that was very near to the Polish border. It was called the Romanton Heath, and here it's called the Romanton Hunting Lodge, and the photo is around 1900. So the portrait that Otto Antoine did, to me, it's sort of like an interesting, moody portrait. A lot of times, just from what I've seen, when Antoine paints trees, the branches are sort of helter-skelter. They're sort of very curved and circular. And then the hunting lodge itself is in the back, and you see sort of that red pop of color on the roof. Sorry, I couldn't get a better picture of this. And this was done, I would say, around 1910. Otto Antoine was very active in the art scene of Berlin, I would say easily from 1900 onward. And he was esteemed enough that he would be part of juries that would judge artwork going into the Berlin exhibitions. And this is one of the few photos I think we have of Otto Antoine, a full portrait of him standing. And you can see my arrow there. That's Otto Antoine, second in from the left. And the caption on this painting said, "The opening of the major Berlin art exhibit, the jury at work." Again, this is 1920. And what they're judging here, I'm not quite sure what that is. It could have been some sort of mythological sculpture. There's like a little child, maybe it's a cherub or something on top of this figure, but I don't know what it was, but very intriguing. So, as mentioned, when Otto Antoine did his training in the early 1890s, he switched his style over to oil paintings. And what I see, and Jacqueline, I'd love to hear your opinion when we talk here in a little bit. I feel that his style for most of this earlier period, what I would term unrestrained brush strokes, dominant colors, reds, blues, and greens, a lot of countryside paintings, cityscapes, and also he did paintings related to the postal service. So in 1920, I'd like to read a quote here. He was cited as an artist in 1920 that he represented Berlin in bold colors, and that was actually written about Antoine in 1920. So we're going to see a number of oil paintings. These are with the Todd Barrowcliff collection. So the painting on the left, I love the swirls in the sky. I believe that is a church. Upper right-hand corner, sort of a cityscape. I don't think that's Berlin. It doesn't look quite as populated, but a lovely bridge over a river. In the lower right-hand corner, sort of very dense forest scene. I don't think this was around Koblenz, maybe some of the more mountainous areas around Germany, but I love the sky coming through the forest trees. Here we have some more oil paintings. We have sort of a village scene right here. Again, you've got a dominant color of the reds on the roof, and it looks like there's an open area at the base. They've got a character, some sort of person standing there. But again, to me, it's a very impressionistic scene. In the upper right-hand corner, we have the Berlin Gate, obviously in Berlin. This was the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. This was one of Antoine's favorite things to paint, both during his early years and later, which we'll see in a moment. But my family does have a portrait of his doing the Berlin Gate. It does need some restoration work, so that's why I'm not showing it at this point. In the lower right-hand corner, sort of a countryside scene with some cottages. And again, if you look at how the rocks are painted, very impressionistic with swirling brown and beige tones. And again, the dominant green trees. Now, these images are from various art auction houses. If you Google Otto Antoine, he's in many auction houses at this time. The painting on the left is a Berlin cityscape. In the upper right-hand corner, this is a very odd painting. It is a balloon, somebody in a balloon over an area called the Vosges. And the Vosges was and is sort of a medium mountain range in France that borders on Germany. But, given this was probably maybe in the early 1900s, I'm not sure how safe I would have felt up in that balloon, but it was a real balloon, very interesting. And in the lower right-hand corner, it's just a seascape. Again, the beautiful bright blue patterns, colors in the water. And then you see an orange on the rocks in the landscape. Again, you've got some bright dominant colors there. Otto Antoine was in a number of exhibitions. This is a partial list. This is what I could find online. Prior to the coming in of the Nazi art edicts, which we'll talk about here, he had many, many showings, 1900 up to at least 1923. What you see on the right-hand side is actually the cover of the exhibition booklet for the 1923 exhibition. I love that font. It's a very dominant, very German-looking font. Otto Antoine, though, was in the German-approved exhibitions in 1937 and 1940. These were called the Great German Art Exhibits. As many of you know, at this time, I think starting in 1937, there were the degenerate art exhibits. And his paintings were not in that, even though some of his early paintings were an impressionistic style. So again, talking about the Reich Culture edicts, and I want to give some background here. Todd Barrowcliff was very friendly, almost like a family member with Otto Antoine's grandson, Fred Albright. And Fred Albright had many stories that he told, and the same story would be told over and over again, that Antoine hated the Nazis. And some of Antoine's works were condemned. I found some records that some of his works were removed from the Berlin City Hall. However, some of Antoine's works, especially, let's say, of the Brandenburg Gate and some of the other architecture in Berlin, were approved by the Nazis and purchased and or stolen, depending. So again, this goes back to the theme of this talk in terms of defiance and compliance. One of the stories that Fred Albright told a number of times was that Antoine painted Hitler as the devil. There was at least one portrait done of this, and at some time after 1933, this portrait was found not on Antoine's properties, but somewhere else. I'm not sure if he sold it to someone over some underground location. The SS did come to Antoine's address. They beat him up and threw all his art supplies out on the road. So this was sort of a very dramatic thing for him. And what I've got here on the right-hand side is just a painting done in 1925. I have that in black and white, though, because I think if you look at Antoine's works later after 1933, I think some of that impressionistic swirling brushstroke and the colors become muted. I think that they disappear somewhat. But again, there are records that he defied the Nazis, but then on the other hand, he did have some of his works exhibited at their shows. Antoine's works were also in the Chicago World's Fair, which went from 1933 to 1934. I've seen his names in catalogs. I don't have the names of his works. On the lower left-hand side is a souvenir booklet of what the building looked like. You have a photo there on the right-hand side, and that looks to me like the Bauhaus architecture style. Maybe Jacqueline, you could tell me if I'm right on that, but it looks very much like the early 1930s architecture style that was popular. Antoine made trips to Indiana. So connecting with my family, John Philip Roskin, again, it would have been his uncle, settled in Indiana, had 4 daughters. One of his daughters was my great-grandmother, but also one of his daughters, whose name was Millie Roskin Boris, she was an artist in her own right. So she would have been a first cousin to Antoine, and she studied with T.C. Steele and William Merritt Chase. So she was part of the Hoosier School, I think they called it, from Indiana. And I think on the 1936 trip, Otto Antoine teamed up with Millie Roskin Boris and some of the other cousins and took a trip to the Brown County Art Colony. It's maybe today it's about an hour and a half south of Indianapolis. It was an established art colony, like many other art colonies in the 1900s. I think of like the McDowell colony in New Hampshire, sort of similar. And of course, Otto Antoine at this point was hailed as the painter of Berlin, etc. And he traveled here in 1936 and 1939. Now, there are also family records that on one of these trips, he smuggled in his artwork. So, you know how you saw the painting of the Kaiser's Hunting Lodge? And I mentioned there's also a painting he did of the Brandenburg Gate. Those were smuggled in, wrapped up in tablecloths. So I don't know why they were actually smuggled, but the family has always used that term that they were smuggled in. I'm not sure at this point because Hitler appreciated his artwork. If Antoine felt he could not take them out of the country, I'm not sure if he sold them. So there's still some mystery as to why that was the case. So let's fast forward a little bit to the war years. And this is a self-portrait of Antoine, I'm guessing maybe around 1945. But his home in Berlin was destroyed in 1942. And he and his wife moved to Bodensee, which is the German name for Lake Constance. And he actually continued his painting. So as I learned in my reading, you could have ability, you could have, just like, you would have those pieces of paper to get food and supplies, where you could have those pieces of paper or ability to get art supplies. So he had the ability to get very scarce art supplies and continue his painting. I think he switched back somewhat to watercolor at this time, and some of his last paintings were of Lake Constance. Now, the good thing is, of course, let's say the war is ended at 1945. His work was honored at a huge exhibit in Berlin. I believe 64 of his works were on display. And I want to read some of the descriptions of his artwork, so reviews. And I've read this in German, I've translated, but I think I translated fairly well. So some of the descriptions of Antoine and his artworks were: Berlin is quite familiar to him. Only quiet love paints like this. He goes his own way as a painter. He paints as he feels. This is how Berlin and Antoine are together. The color is his element, the pure mixture which only comes like chords of music. The red is his accent. I think those were beautiful descriptions of his works in this show. Antoine, his oldest son, actually became a scientist and engineer of sorts. He was very expert with radio technology, and I found record that his son, Herbert Antoine, was involved in Radio Free Europe in Berlin in 1951. In my perspective, this might have been a bit of a dangerous profession at that time. So to me, the rebelliousness from Antoine went to his son. So I think that's an interesting comment. So again, this is one of the paintings from that show, and his love of colors, etc. I heard from talking to Todd Barrowcliff that Antoine really wanted Berlin to become a major art center like other places throughout Europe. He wanted it to rival Rome and London and Paris. And I think when he saw, the Nazis come in and the very strict art that was only permitted at that time, I think it was very difficult for him. Now, something interesting I found in my research, I'll go to any number of online databases, and I searched Otto Antoine's name at our Library of Congress, and I found that one of his paintings was in a catalog that was of Hitler's favorite art. He had many pieces of art at this point, many which were stolen. Some were bought, but I think many of those were bought under duress. And Otto Antoine's work showed up in one of these catalogs. And these catalogs also, and all this art that he had collected, was supposed to be in a museum, Linz, Austria. Of course, Hitler was born in Linz, Austria. There was going to be a grand museum that was going to be built there. There were already designs done of it by his architect, Albert Speer. And it was partly a revenge, because when Hitler tried to get into art school, it was in Vienna. We know that he was rejected, and he wanted this art museum to be much grander and to rival any of the art scene of Vienna. So the description of this painting in the lower right-hand corner, of course, this is black and white. The original would have been in color. It was simply called At the Great Memorial. And a very loose translation of some of what we're seeing here. Let me just find my notes. So it says the House of German Art from the Führer's to be part of the Great German Art Exhibit in 1940. So potentially, maybe this work in the lower right-hand corner was at one of these Nazi-approved art exhibits in 1940. And to me, if you look at it, it's very structured, very angular. There's not a lot, to me, impressionistic feeling in this painting in the lower right-hand corner. Interestingly, when I first started researching Antoine 4 years ago, two of his paintings showed up in the Lost Art database. And many of these paintings here are of the many works of art that might have been stolen by the Nazis. They could be in private holdings now, but they were lost. And there are, I think, hundreds of paintings here. Just recently, I went into this database again, and only one of the Antoine works is listed. The other one that was shown, let's say 6 years ago, the title of it was On the Lagoon. So it might have been one of those lagoon paintings like we saw earlier, but I'd need to research to see how and where it was found. I think that would be interesting. So the one painting that is still there, I'll just read the history. It's always fascinating to me how these artworks became lost. This was an oil painting of Leipziger Street. It was purchased in 1915 for the state from the holdings of the Berlin Art Exhibit. And in the early 1920s, it was on loan to the Upper Silesian Museum of Arts and Crafts. And by 1945, it seemed to have been lost. And the record was put in by the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation State Museum. Very interesting. So I would like to share Todd Barrowcliff's website. Again, these are copyrighted images, but what Todd has done, he has sectioned all of these artworks. As you can see, this is a picture right here of the front of the website. So the paintings are there by watercolor, oil, pencil, all sorts of interesting things. And again, as we'll mention maybe more, there's a lot of interest right now in Otto Antoine because of an article that came out on the internet in the magazine Art News that I know Jacqueline was part of. One more slide here. So here's my contact information. I did put it at the beginning in the chat. And if anybody wants to communicate with me, I'd love to communicate with people from these presentations. And again, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for this very dense and also personal presentation. I actually in the chat, Ulf Norbert Funke has posted links to images from the Große Deutsche Kunstausstellung, where Antoine's Bilder were exhibited in 1938, 1940, 1941, 42, 43, and 44. So almost every year. So thank you so much for Ulf Norbert for that. But I want to ask you now, Jacqueline, how did you meet Otto Antoine, or better, his work? Like, how did that happen for you, and what did you discover?
Sure. Thank you so much for your interesting talk, Kathleen. It was so interesting to see it too with the images playing, because I've listened to your podcast on Otto several times. So I was contacted by the collector whose images were featured in this presentation at the beginning of the summer. And he said, I'm looking for someone who knows a bit about German art. And it was just serendipitous, really, thinking about how he lives in a suburb of Dallas and I'm in Dallas, and he has this large art collection, and I could just drive in and come see it. So we arranged one afternoon, and after some chatting on Zoom, he wanted to kind of get ideas of how he could go about bringing it to the market. And so I drove to their house from Todd and Naomi, and that's when it all happened. I walked through the door, and he said he had a big trunk filled with artwork, but as soon as I walked in, I saw lots of his paintings on the walls and immediately recognized they were of a great quality. And as you were explaining, I really think there is a kind of style that you can recognize in Otto Antoine with his coloration. He tends to have pops of bright color. And then also with his cityscapes, he tends to have one or two little human elements to remind you that it is a lived-in space. So those are always kind of fun. Then we started to go through the trunk. And by the way, Todd and Naomi are very sweet, nice people. And they explained how they got this work from the grandson. And it was literally, this trunk is probably the size of a small kitchen island. And I thought, oh gosh, I'll have to come back. But there was so much to go through. And I just saw paintings, drawings, sketches, and lots of personal letters. So there's a lot more to go through and a lot more work needs to be done on this artist. I am amazed with all that you were able to gather here, Kathleen, because it's like we're dealing with a German artist who works almost all of his life in Germany. So all those archives are over there, but then we have some stuff online. So we're kind of like sleuths piecing it together. So, and then presenting it in an interesting way. And then, of course, like things are not often written down during times of war. So we have to kind of read in between the lines sometimes. But with the Barrowcliffs collection, we can still, though, look at the artworks themselves as evidence of something, which is very neat. So that's how I became involved. They wanted kind of someone to look and evaluate their collection. And I said, well, I'm more in the academic sense, but I can tell you this is of great cultural value. And I hope to get to study it more over the years. And I have lots of ideas for articles to come and how it can kind of be a kind of like a way to better understand that time period as a whole. So that's why I'm familiar with Otto Antoine. I got to handle some of it, of course, wearing white gloves. So it's there. I'm in a suburb of Dallas, of all places. So
Yeah. So how many works are there, and how did Todd Barrowcliff get to have that collection? I believe he's also part of this presentation. So I hope if we come to questions that we can't answer, that he will help us answer them. So, but right now it's you, Jacqueline, to how many works are there? How many letters, documents are there? Hi, Todd. Okay, I see you're here. Thank you. So, yeah.
He counted them out, and it's some 200 works of art. So the tally, I believe, is in the article. Nearly, oh man, Todd, can you tell us the exact number? But it's almost, or it's a little over 200, and that doesn't include all of the personal items like the letters and such.
If I could just interject as we're waiting for Todd to reply, I think that really getting into some of those personal correspondence, I think there's some very interesting history there. Todd had, scanned those and shared them with me. I've never had time to process. So I think you're right, Jacqueline. There's a lot there I think we can dig into.
Definitely. And a lot of it, it's handwritten, and it will take time to kind of either transcribe it and translate it, but to figure out what it's for. The other thing too that was in there was there seems to be ledgers of some kind that tell us how much he was pricing his works. And then also he has, like, it seems like rough inventories of what he's made. So then that could help us kind of figure out what he was making when, and figuring out his varying amounts of color. So there is a lot to dig into.
That's very exciting.
Yeah.
So, and you said, Kathleen, that Antoine made two trips to Indiana in 1936 and 39. So did he bring artwork on both of those trips, or was it one of those trips? Or
I think Rachel was only one of the trips, and I don't know which one it was. I would think it might have been the one in 1936, since he met up with all his relatives at that time. It's hard to say though. I don't know. Maybe if we look through some of those private papers, we're going to have a better sense of that timeline.
Mhm.
I think what's interesting to me, he came back on the ship the Deutschland, I think in May of 1939. That's only, I think, 3 months before the invasion of Poland. So he's traveling. I think would have been a tense international time.
Yeah, yeah. And one wonders whether is there any proof that he at any point thought of immigrating to the US, coming to the US? Because
I,
bringing over all this artwork, would seem like, an attempt to establish himself and kind of build his name in the US, in Indiana.
it is intriguing that his works ended up over there. And also, what's intriguing to me, his wife never traveled with him. So only was him alone when he came to Indiana.
Hmm.
Interesting.
Well, it wasn't so cheap either, right? So it's kind of a big trip. Um,
It definitely arduous to be on a boat that long and such too.
And I want to do a little more digging. I've read somewhere, but I'd like to look at this more academically. I think even non-Jews who traveled out of Germany, there were restrictions on how much money they could take out in the 1930s. So there might have been some other restrictions at that time that bear looking at.
hmm Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And the question is also like, what kind of correspondence is there? So ledgers and pricing and, also lists of his artwork kind of support the idea that he was thinking of either bringing to his daughter some of his estate for her to have it. That in itself would make a lot of sense already, right? To keep some works that he considered the best of his works in the family. And I think that might be another consideration that he might have to look at the collection. He might have thought these are either the most personal works that he made, the works that his daughter related to in some way, in theme or in some other personal way, or he thought these were his best works. That's what I would want my children to have too, if I would be a painter.
Interesting point. Yeah. And also, a lot of his paintings of the Postal Service, some of them would be interior to the buildings, people sorting mails, all of those stayed in Germany, understandably.
Of course. Yeah. And what happened to his estate when he died in Germany?
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. And so how did Todd end up with this estate?
So
Todd,
he,
you go ahead, Jacqueline.
oh, it's okay. Or either way, I think you've known Todd for much longer. But he was in California and renting from the grandson of Otto Antoine.
Mhm.
So they sounded real friendly. I don't know. I don't know if he told me this, but I'm imagining maybe even he was like an uncle of sorts to his kids. But he basically said he sold small pieces to Todd and Naomi, and then by the end of his life, he was realizing, okay, I want my grandfather to be remembered, but I'll give this all to you, this whole collection, but you need to promise me that you won't separate it. So then that way, as a whole, it can be better studied and considered. Okay, you said correct. Cool. So then,
Absolutely right. And I think that's been a really, really strong direction with Todd. He does not want to break up this collection. He wants it to be in total and to be appreciated that way.
sure.
Yeah.
And interesting what you said about which works was he bringing to give to his kids. So his legacy through his children was interesting because those are probably the pieces that he liked the most, the subject matter. So the hunting lodge of the Prussian emperor was the good old days, maybe. And then also, if you're looking through, one thing I found kind of cute and interesting in the trunk with the various images was there were lots of drawings of little kitty cats. So thinking of
Oh,
family pets in there, those aren't going to be the ones bought by Hitler and Goebbels, unfortunately. So
no, no.
that kind of gives you an idea of kind of kind of a guy he was. And then that very cute picture of Antoinette. I think she's crying, I hate to say. I don't know if she's
You're probably right about that.
but
And the thing of it is, too, I don't think Antoine never ever knew that his works were going to be designated for that museum in Linz. And I think it's good he never knew that, because I don't think that sort of information was available to the public about this museum that Hitler was planning.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So he did exhibit in those exhibitions. So and I mean, he for sure knew that it was a possibility that somebody who supported the Nazi ideology would be buying the works, right? So at that time, he also was, I think we should say, he retired from the postal office, from what I read, by
1930.
1930. So by 1933, he was working as a free artist, right? Like an independent artist.
Right.
And for sure eager to sell his work, because I'm sure he had a pension payment, but um, I'm sure he also wanted to make some additional money from sales and exhibitions. So he did participate in these exhibitions, and um, uh, so. But what was the story that, or can you, one of you tell the story about this, his paintings with Hitler as a devil? Is that, yeah, I don't know who wants to tell that story.
Well, from talking to Todd, and I just spoke with him about a week ago, this was a story told very explicitly again and again by Fred Albright to Todd and his wife, Naomi. So I think the story was told so many times. I don't think it was a recollection issue. I think it was something real. But again, the motivation to that, and again, my understanding is the painting was not found on Antoine's residence, but somewhere else. Todd, you can chime in on that if that is correct. And I don't know what the motivation was. And something that I want to research is there was a very tight set of artists, even after, the German edict of art, if you will, in 1933. Was there some sort of maybe subtle underground activity of some of these artists? And I want to study some of the other artists that he was close to at the time that seemed to comply. But you know what I'm saying? Maybe some of his compatriots or some activities he did that Antoine might have been involved in. And again, this is conjecture, but it bears research.
Jacqueline, what do you think? What do you know?
uh, it's just l looking back at the different artists who participated in the Große Kunstausstellung, they fit the propagandistic mission of the Nazis and were often selected for that reason, regardless of their own identity or their own beliefs or political beliefs. So I mean, there are like Arno Brecker, a great sculptor. There are several artists that are very talented, but also associated with that exhibition. It's a tough aspect of history to grapple with because it represents so much hate at that time.
Mhm.
In particular, the piece of the Gatehouse or the Ehrenmal, the Berliner Ehrenmal, with, I think it was the Friedrich of Prussia sculpture out front. I
Mhm.
would really like, one thing I want to do more research on is how, like, that political spot, right in Schinkel's Berlin, which Otto Antoine was really attuned to, right? He's doing the Brandenburg Gate, he's doing the new gatehouse. He realizes that they're quintessentially Berlin during that time, and he's kind of documenting how it changes from pre-World War II to Hitler's World War II, and then post, perhaps. So that could be documented. I know he wasn't around for when it became Kathy Kollwitz, that Neue Wache, but it would be interesting to see how kind of visually this space changes and how propagandistically Schinkel's Berlin has changed. So at least it can help to better understand this time, I guess we could say, is the value there.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And Todd chimed in, and Todd recollects also, does his wife, that Antoine was associated with a group of artists that were very anti-Nazi, at least privately, if you will. And I think the other thing to bear in mind, when Antoine had his last show in 1950, of course, Berlin was just still a bombed out shell at this point. I've seen pictures, and the Berlin Gate, Brandenburg Gate, still stood, but there was nothing around it. It was like one of the few vestiges that was there in 1950. And I think it was a very, I hate to use the term sentimental art show, but I think a lot of people that attended saw the Berlin of the past that would never be again at that show.
Yeah, you have a very good point there. And but at the same time, the Allies very quickly made sure that tried to revive culture and allow everyone in a democratic way to produce and show their artworks and show their produce culturally. And they gave artists made material available, and of course the influence of American art was very, very strong, and the influence of abstract art was very strong, because after this heavy figurative, this very strong focus on figurative art in the Nazi during the Nazi time, and Arno Breker had a great career as a sculptor during the Nazi time, and there's basically not much beyond these sculptures that we recall when we hear the name. So he's definitely the one of the poster artists of the Nazi era, so figurative art was really avoided pretty much. But of course, Antoine's art, and I think you're right there, Kathleen, that that was sentimental, definitely sentimental, and was definitely also not dangerous, because it was art that the Nazis liked, because it was very traditional in a way. Impressionist art was not being revolutionary anymore by the time the Nazis came around. And so it was definitely a safe art to show, so but there was a very in the late 40s and early 50s, there was a very active art cultural life, because that also was, because there were still, as you said, Berlin was completely bombed to the ground. There were big shortages in food, and and we all know what it does to our soul to go to a concert, to a comedy, to to look at art. It just is good for the soul, and you might be distracted from hunger and the life circumstances for a bit. So that's for sure.
I'll just say quickly, it's so helpful for me to hear your perspective, Rachel and Jacqueline, because again, I think all these perspectives, if we bring them together, we could better understand where he was coming from and what the culture and life was at that time.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah, for
Absolutely.
sure. Hmm?
I also think it's interesting too, his role in the post office.
Mm.
I think that adds an added layer of familiarity. And then also, I know his job ceases there, as you said, 1930, but those images are being sent all over the country and potentially all over the world. So maybe that's also, there's a sense of familiarity with him that makes him super German for the idea of the Linz Museum too. So
Oh, I
that
see what you're saying. Right, right.
Mhm.
so I think it's interesting, he wasn't able to be an artist full time, but his post office work ended up really kind of helping him out. And you said that in your podcast. I remember it's like,
Yes.
oh, that's a great point because it gave him stability.
Economic stability and a steady job.
Yeah.
Plus a studio, I read, right? He had a studio in the Postal Museum where he was employed. Like at some point, from what I read, he moved or was moved from the postal office to the Postal Museum to take care of the and display the collections. And there he must have had a studio. So uh, that's really great, being paid for having your private space and to do your work is not bad. Um, so a lot of advantages. I totally agree. Yeah,
Yes, for sure. Well, it's on my list to go there. The Telecommunications Museum in
mhm,
Berlin.
right.
I've probably passed it by a million times, but I think, fine arts, because I'm an art historian, I go to those. But I need to stop by that one again soon and take a closer look. So,
Yeah, and that I think is what we probably all realize. Yes, the material has to be seen and studied and translated, and that's a very big thing. But then the archives in Germany have to be studied, and all those. I mean, you can find out which you know, whether he became part of the Nazi party, like there are lots of facts to be found out in the archives in Germany. So, um, but I'm glad that Todd was able to hold the collection together and that it's becoming known now, and that this is a lot of studies are being initiated, and hopefully the collection will find a destination, find a home where this study is kind of inbuilt in a university or something that enables the study of this material. So. Thank you so much to both of you, and thank you for Todd being here as well. And yeah, please keep us updated on any progress. I hope that many more studies will come out now, and that we'll learn much more about Otto Antoine and his life, and find more of his works, of course.
Thank you, Rachel.
thank you. It's a privilege to meet one of his ancestors. How neat is
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. Be well and take care.